the Law of One Breakdown channel. Have you ever wondered what the raw material actually says about Jesus, free will, sexuality, and even hair? Each week we go straight to the original sessions and explore one topic through the pure wisdom of the Law of One. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy this subject. Let's begin.
Hello, today I'm going to be talking about Jesus and what the raw folks, or raw, have to say about him. So we'll start with the first session. Dawn asks, can you tell me if Jesus of Nazareth came from the Confederation before incarnation here? Now, anyone who's not familiar with the Law of One, the Confederation is a group of beings, probably extraterrestrial, probably a bunch humanoid and human as well, but of different densities. They're generally fourth and above. Ra says, the one known to you as Jesus did not have a name. This entity was a member of the fourth density of the highest level of the sub-octave. So each density that we evolve in has 7 levels, basically. And Jesus was at the tail end of the 7th, so he could actually graduate into 5th, but that's coming up. Okay, so this entity was desirous of entering this planetary sphere in order to share the love vibration in as pure a manner as possible. Thus, this entity received permission to perform this mission. This entity was then a wanderer, or as some people say, starseeds, of no name, of Confederation origins of 4th density, representing the 4th density understanding of the vibration and understanding of love. 4th density is the density of love, according to the Law of One, and that's what that meant. Okay, Ra goes on to say in session 1712, this entity, or I just say Jesus, could have gone on to the 5th density, but chose instead to return to 3rd for this particular mission. This entity was of the highest sub-octave of the vibration of love. This is 4th density. Then Dawn asks, when Jesus incarnated, was there an attempt by the Orion group to discredit him in some way? Again, if people aren't familiar with the Law of One, the Orion group are of negatively polarized. They got permission to actually come to Earth, and that's some of the trouble that we have here. That could be a different podcast, but so that's what that means. And Ra says this is correct. Yes, they're stinkers. They just have a different polarization, and they have ways that they do their things. And so, okay, session 1717. Dawn asks, can you tell me what the Orion group did in order to try to cause his downfall? And Ra goes on to say, we may describe in general what occurred. The technique was that of building upon other negatively oriented information. This information had been given by the one whom your peoples called Yahweh. This information involved many strictures upon behavior and promised power of the 3rd density, service to self and nature. These 2 types of distortions were impressed upon those already oriented to think these thought forms. Basically, what that means is the Orion group tried to tempt him with power. Okay, this eventually led to many challenges of the entity known as Jesus. It eventually led to one sound vibration complex, it's another way of saying person, Judas, as you call this entity, who believed that it was doing the appropriate thing in bringing about or forcing upon the one you call Jesus. The necessity for bringing in the 3rd density planetary power distortion of 3rd density rule over others. Again, it's just another way of saying Jesus was tempted with power. Like, join us and you'll have ultimate power. Interestingly, if anyone has read The Disappearance of the Universe, which is based a lot on the Course of Miracles. Anyway, they had something to say about Judas in that he was drunk when he kind of turned Jesus in, and that he felt awful after the fact and ended up killing himself by hanging. Okay, it's a little side note there. This entity, Judas, felt that if pushed into a corner, the entity you called Jesus would then be able to see the wisdom of using the power of intelligent infinity in order to rule others. The one you called Judas was mistaken in this estimation of the reaction of Jesus, whose learning was not oriented towards this distortion, negatively polarized, basically. This resulted in the destruction of the bodily complex of the one you know of Jesus. So Jesus was tempted. He said no. And ultimately, we know how that ends. Okay, session 1719. Dawn asks, how did Jesus learn this during his incarnation? Which, prior to the session, they were talking about healing. And so it went on, and then Dawn asked, how did Jesus learn about this during his incarnation, which was healing and miracles? And Ra says, this entity learned the ability by a natural kind of remembering at a very young age. Unfortunately, this entity first discovered his ability to penetrate intelligent infinity by becoming the distortion you call angry. So Jesus got pissed. And he got pissed at his playmate. This entity was touched by the entity known as Jesus to you and was fatally wounded. So apparently Jesus is a child, because he had some degree of remembrance. He was able to restore some of his powers from fourth density, essentially, in his incarnation body here. And he got mad at a playmate, apparently, and fatally wounded him. Thus, the one known as Jesus became aware that there dwelt in him a terrible potential. Just the energy, it's the intelligent energy of the negatively polarized instead of the positive, is what that was. Let's see. This entity determined to discover how to use this energy for the good, not for the negative. This entity was extremely positively polarized and remembered more than most wanderers or starseeds do. Dawn asks, how did this aggressive action against a playmate affect Jesus in his spiritual growth? Where did he go after his physical death? So that's two questions there. Okay. So Ross says the entity you call Jesus was galvanized by this experience and began a lifetime of seeking and searching. This entity studied first day and night in its own religious constructs, which you call Judaism, and was learned enough to become a rabbi, as you call the teach learners of this particular rhythm or distortion of understanding. So, if people are new to the Law of One, it's kind of hard to disseminate, sometimes the way Ross speaks. But basically, Jesus learned enough in Judaism to become a rabbi. That's basically what that says. Okay, moving on. At the age of approximately 13 1/2 of your years, this entity left the dwelling place of its earthly family, as you would call it, and walked into many other places seeking further information. This went on sporadically until the entity was approximately 25, at which time it returned to its family dwelling and learned and practiced the art of its earthly father, the carpentry, I believe. When Jesus had become able to integrate or synthesize all experiences, he began to speak to others. Basically, he began to learn, or teach, rather. And the Raw folks always say teach, learn. Learn, teach. Okay. What it had felt during the preceding years to be of an worthwhile nature. The entity was absolved karmically of the destruction of the other self when it was in its late portion of life, and spoke upon what you would call a cross, saying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. In forgiveness lies the stoppage of the wheel of action, or what you call karma. So what Ra's basically saying is that, basically on the cross, he forgave people, and that stopped his wheel of karma, if you will, in the death of his playmate. Okay, session 1721, Dawn asks, in which density does the entity known as Jesus now reside? And then Ra says, this information is harmless, though unimportant. This entity studies now the lessons of the wisdom vibration, the fifth density, also called the light vibration. Session 1722, Dawn asks, in our culture, there is a great saying that he will return. Can you tell me if this is planned? And hopefully this isn't going to offend any Christians, because here's what Ra said. And then Ra says, I will attempt to sort out this question. It is difficult. This entity became aware that it is not an entity of itself, but operated as a messenger of the one creator whom the entity saw as love. This entity was aware that this cycle was in its last portion and spoke to the effect that those of its consciousness would return at the harvest. So we're at the end of a 25,000 year cycle, one of 3, and that's what that meant. The particular mind-body-spirit complex you call Jesus is as what you would call an entity, not to return except as a member of the Confederation, occasionally speaking through a channel. However, there are others of the identical congruency of consciousness that will welcome those to the fourth density. This is the meaning of the returning. So it sounds like he might speak through folks here and there, but he's not going to just come back here, and because he's in fifth density now, and Earth is graduating. Well, according to Ra, we're already in the fourth density, but our consciousness levels keeping things slow. Okay, moving on. Session 7313. Ra goes on to say, you may have read some of this entity's workings. It offered itself as a teacher to those mind-body-spirit complexes, i.e. people, which gathered to hear, and even then spoke as though through a veil, as to leave room for those not wishing to hear. Okay, the reason why he did that is because if you blah, blah, blah your own truth on somebody and really just basically, it's basically taking away one's free will to think and figure things out on their own. So that's why he would teach, but he would also leave this veil on for people who really didn't want or weren't ready, to start, the process of understanding themselves and whatnot. When the entity was asked to heal, it oft times did so, always ending the working with two rules, basically. First, that the entity healed had been healed by its faith. That is, its ability to allow and accept changes through the violet ray, which is like the 7th chakra, into the gateway of intelligent energy. Secondly, the saying always, tell no one. These are the workings which attempt a maximal quality of free will while maintaining fidelity to the positive purity of the working. Whew, that was a tough one to read. Okay, session 7316, Dawn asks, the one known as Jesus accumulated 12 disciples. What was his purpose in having these disciples with him? And Ra says, what is the purpose of teach learning if there is no learned teachers? Those drawn to this entity were accepted by this entity without regard for any outcome. This entity accepted the honor, the duty placed upon it by its nature, and its sense that to speak was its mission. So Jesus felt like he was supposed to teach, and he didn't care, apparently, according to the Ra folks, he didn't care if there was an actual outcome. And Ra has said this too, when Dawn was asking about, do you think this book will go out and teach a lot of people? And Ra said, if it even helps awaken one, it's worth it. So it sounds like Jesus had the same attitude in that he did it because he felt like he was supposed to do it and through love and not just to have a big following, no ego in it sounded like. Okay, in session 75, 14 through 15, Ra talks about martyrdom in Jesus. So Jesus embraced martyrdom, which is the work of love without wisdom. Those who seek further the consequences of martyrdom must be considered, for in martyrdom lies the end of the opportunity in the density of the martyr to offer love and light. Each entity must seek its deepest path. So basically, in a nutshell, it says it's the work of love without wisdom. And basically, Ra's saying, you got to consider the consequences of martyrdom, because once you're out of this body, then you won't be able to teach, learn, teach anymore, basically. Okay, so that's all for the sessions. And so now I'm going to tell you a little Jesus story, if you will. In 2012, I went through something horrendous, and I'm not going to get into the details, but it was horrible. And I was crying in my car, and I was turning a corner, and I literally felt an embrace and the most pure love and compassion. And it was just for a couple seconds, and then it went away, and it really helped me get through this really bad calamity I was going through at the time. Okay, years later, I decided to be a hypnotherapist, and I was doing a lot of more spiritual kind of hypnosis sessions, and I had two different clients. They didn't know each other. These were a couple years apart, too. And we're going through their hypnosis. I'm like, okay, what's going on now? And then they would, blah, blah, blah. And I go, okay, now what's happening? And I'm not kidding. That same absolute love and compassion filled the room. And my client's like, oh, Jesus just showed up. I just got the chills. Okay. And then that happened with another client as well. The same thing. And, I'd gone to the client's house. It was an older lady, and to do this session, trudging along, and I'm like, okay, what's going on now? What's happening now? And the same feeling came over the whole room, and I got the chills, and good chills. And she's like, oh, Jesus just showed up. So, is it Jesus, or is it a positively polarized being of fourth density nature, or fifth, or sixth, or seventh? I don't know for sure, but it was interesting that I had that love, compassion feeling, and it felt exactly the same way as when, quote unquote, Jesus came in to the awareness of two of my clients. So anyway, that was really special. Well, that's it for this podcast, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening, and take care.